What if the Titanic never sank? Imagine a world where the Titanic never hit the iceberg. No disaster, no panic, no famous movie. No tragedy that would become one of the most recognizable events in human history. Instead, the RMS Titanic arrives safely in New York on April 17, 1912. Thousands of passengers disembark. Newspapers praise it as the greatest ship ever built. And then, history changes. But just how much would actually be different? Today, we're exploring one of history's most fascinating alternate timelines. What if the Titanic never sank? The voyage continues. It's the night of April 14, 1912. The Titanic is speeding through the North Atlantic. In our timeline, an iceberg appears directly in the ship's path. The crew spots it too late. The ship strikes the ice, opening fatal wounds below the waterline. But in this alternate reality, something changes. Perhaps the sea is slightly calmer. Perhaps the lookout spots the iceberg 30 seconds earlier. Perhaps the ship turns just enough. Whatever the reason, the Titanic narrowly avoids disaster. Passengers sleep peacefully as the ship sails onward. No alarms, no lifeboats, no tragedy. 3 days later, Titanic arrives in New York Harbor to enormous crowds and international praise. The voyage is considered a complete success. The White Star Line celebrates. The ship becomes a symbol of modern engineering and luxury. But this success creates a problem. Nobody learns the lessons that came from the disaster. Safety regulations never arrive. One of the biggest consequences of the Titanic sinking was the complete overhaul of maritime safety. After the tragedy, governments introduced new regulations. Ships were required to carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Continuous radio monitoring became standard. Ice patrols were established in the North Atlantic. These changes saved countless lives throughout the 20th century. But if Titanic never sinks, many of these reforms are delayed. Shipping companies continue prioritizing luxury and profit over safety. Ships remain under-equipped with lifeboats. Radio operators are not required to monitor distress frequencies around the clock. Future disasters become far more likely. Ironically, Titanic's survival may lead to even greater maritime tragedies later on. History often learns through failure. Without the Titanic disaster, one of history's most important safety wake-up calls never happens. The White Star Line becomes dominant. The White Star Line suffered enormous damage after the sinking. Not just financially, its reputation was shattered. But in this alternate timeline, Titanic becomes the company's greatest advertisement. Passengers flock to book tickets. The ship completes voyage after voyage. Its sister ships become even more popular. The White Star Line gains a massive advantage over competitors. For years, the company dominates transatlantic travel. The Titanic itself becomes a celebrity. Traveling aboard it becomes a status symbol for the wealthy. Imagine being able to say you crossed the Atlantic on the largest ship in the world. People would have lined up for the opportunity. Famous passengers live different lives. Over 1,500 people died in the Titanic disaster. Many of them were ordinary passengers. Others were some of the wealthiest and most influential people alive. One of them was businessman John Jacob Astor IV. At the time, he was among the richest people on Earth. Had he survived, his investments and influence could have shaped American business for decades. Another was Benjamin Guggenheim. His family already controlled a vast industrial empire. Additional years of leadership could have changed major business decisions across the United States. Even lesser-known passengers may have altered history. A scientist, entrepreneur, inventor, or politician who died aboard Titanic might have gone on to make discoveries or decisions we never got to see. The butterfly effect becomes impossible to predict. One life saved can eventually affect millions. And Titanic would have saved more than 1,500. World War I still happens. Now let's address the biggest question. Would Titanic surviving prevent World War I? Probably not. The forces driving Europe toward war were already in motion. Nationalism, military alliances, imperial competition. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 would likely still occur. The First World War would still erupt. However, Titanic itself may play a surprising role. During wartime, many civilian ships were converted for military use. Troop transport, medical ships, supply vessels. A surviving Titanic could have been recruited by the British government. The most famous passenger liner in the world might eventually become part of the war effort. And that creates new possibilities. Titanic could still be lost, just under very different circumstances. The missing cultural icon. Perhaps the biggest change isn't political, it's cultural. Because without the sinking, Titanic becomes just another ship. A successful ship, but just a ship. There are no documentaries, no memorials, no endless fascination. And perhaps, most importantly, no movie. James Cameron's Titanic became one of the highest-grossing films in history. It turned the disaster into a global cultural phenomenon. Without the sinking, that movie never exists. Millions of people would never know the ship's name. It's possible Titanic would be remembered only by history enthusiasts, not by nearly everyone on Earth. The disaster itself is what transformed Titanic into a legend. Without tragedy, there is no myth. A different maritime disaster changes history. History has a strange habit of filling empty spaces. If Titanic never sinks, another catastrophe may take its place. Perhaps another passenger liner suffers a devastating accident. Perhaps thousands die in a later disaster. The public outrage that followed Titanic could simply be transferred elsewhere. The regulations eventually arrive. The safety improvements still happen, just years later, and potentially after an even greater loss of life. Sometimes disasters create changes because they are impossible to ignore. If Titanic never provided that shock, another event eventually would. The question is, how many lives would be lost before society finally acted? The Titanic's long career. Let's imagine the ship survives for decades. What happens next? Titanic continues operating throughout the 1910s and 1920s. Its luxury gradually becomes outdated. Newer ships arrive, larger ships arrive, faster ships arrive. What was once revolutionary becomes ordinary. By the 1930s, Titanic is no longer the king of the oceans. It becomes a relic of a previous era. Eventually, the ship may be retired, perhaps converted into a floating hotel, perhaps scrapped for metal, perhaps preserved as a museum. Ironically, even if Titanic survives, it may end its life quietly and largely forgotten. History often remembers dramatic endings more than successful careers. The bigger lesson. The most surprising part of this alternate history is that Titanic's survival might not improve history overall. The sinking was a terrible tragedy, but the reforms that followed saved countless future lives. The disaster changed maritime law forever. It exposed dangerous practices. It forced governments and companies to improve safety standards. Without the sinking, those changes may have taken years or decades to arrive. That's one of history's greatest paradoxes. Sometimes, terrible events produce lessons that reshape the future. The Titanic became more than a ship. It became a warning. A reminder that technology can fail, that human confidence can become arrogance, and that even the greatest achievements are never truly unsinkable. Conclusion. So what if the Titanic never sank? The White Star Line grows stronger. Thousands of passengers survive. Several influential figures continue their lives. The ship becomes a celebrated engineering triumph. But maritime safety reforms are delayed. Future disasters become more likely, and the Titanic itself fades into history, rather than becoming one of its greatest legends. In the end, the ship's survival may have made the world safer in the short term, but the disaster itself changed the world in ways that are still felt today. And that's what makes alternate history so fascinating. Sometimes, changing a single night can transform an entire century, but not always in the ways we'd expect.